I'll go like this when it's time for you to do your magic.
All right, welcome and thanks for joining us for our inaugural History at High Noon program entitled The Battle of Guilford Courthouse with special guest speaker and author, Dr. John R. Maass. My name is Stacy and I handle adult education over at the North Carolina Museum of History. And we're so glad that you're joining us for this new version of our lunchtime lecture series. History at High Noon is just one of MOH's exciting digital offerings available through our History at Home initiative. So if you'd like to learn more, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at www.ncmuseumofhistory.org. Before we get started, we would like to take this opportunity to thank our North Carolina Museum of History Associates and Foundation for making today's program possible. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which in addition to many other things, helps make programs like this program possible. If you would like to learn more about becoming an associates member, you can head over to their website at www.ncmoha.com. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who graciously donated funding towards today's program. We endeavor to keep our programming free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping these programs going, and we continue to be humbled by your generosity and enthusiasm for our museum and our programs. So we just wanted to say thank you so much. We appreciate you. A few housekeeping tips for today's program. We ask that you please make sure you keep your mic muted throughout the entirety of today's program, and please type any questions that you have for our speaker into the chat function located at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the lecture, I will ask the speaker as many of your questions as time allows. We have a special treat as part of today's lecture. Dr. Maass has offered to autograph his latest book, The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, A Most Desperate Engagement, as part of today's program. You can order your copy on our museum shop website at www.museumofhistoryshop.com. It will be signed and mailed to you while supplies last. All right, so now it is my honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. John Maass. Born on Long Island, New York, and raised in Rockbridge County, Virginia, Dr. Maass is an education staff member at the new National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir. Previously, he was a historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History in Washington, D.C. for 10 years. Dr. Maass received a BA in History from Washington and Lee University, an MA in American History from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and a PhD in Early American History at The Ohio State University in 2007. He is the author of several books and articles on early U.S. military history, including North Carolina and the French and Indian War, The Spreading Flames of War, published in 2013, Defending a New Nation, 1783 to 1811, published in 2013, The Road to Yorktown, Jefferson, Lafayette, and the British Invasion of Virginia, published in 2015, and George Washington's Virginia, published in 2017. His newest book is The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, A Most Desperate Engagement, published in 2020. Dr. Maass was an officer in the U.S. Army Reserves, founder of the Rockbridge Civil War Roundtable, and recipient of the first Tybee Lamb Fellowship from the Society of the Cincinnati. A frequent speaker on historical topics and a Revolutionary War battlefield tour guide, he is currently co-authoring a book on the military history of North Carolina. He currently lives near Mount Vernon, Virginia. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Maass. One second. There we go. All right. It's turned over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Stacy, and I'm glad to be talking to the folks who are affiliated with the North Carolina Museum of History. And today we're going to talk about the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina, and the campaign that led up to the battle. So we'll start with a little brief overview, then talk about the 1781 campaign that led up to the armies being at Guilford Courthouse near Greensboro, North Carolina, the modern name for the area, and then some details about the battle and what it meant. So let's start with the background to the campaign. This campaign and the battle of Guilford Courthouse, which ended the campaign, was part of the British effort to retake the southern colonies and try to occupy them and bring them back to British rule. Now, they had made a few efforts to do that earlier in the war, including the landing in the Cape Fear area and the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in February 1776, and some other campaigning in the Savannah and Charleston area in 1778 and 1779. The British were convinced that if they showed up in the South with a large force, that thousands and thousands of people who were still loyal to the king would rise up, support and supply them, and probably more importantly, join the British ranks or form their own regiments to help conquer the South, help defeat patriot forces, and keep law and order for the king. And they were convinced that there were many, many people who would do that. And to a large extent, they were correct. But as we will talk about over the next few minutes, the British were really off on how they were going to use the loyalists properly. So first, we'll talk about the British invasion, which was in February of 1780. And the British forces under Sir Henry Clinton and his second in command, Lord Cornwallis, came down to the Carolinas. And as you see, I just put a map on there. Charleston is just south of this map below Georgetown, but I wanted to show you these locations because we're going to talk about them as we go along. So the British landed south of Charleston and moved north. They conducted a siege of Charleston, which ended with the city surrendering to British forces in May of 1780. It was a very large force of American Continentals and militia troops. It was a tremendous blow to the Americans, who all of a sudden had no major American army in the South. So the British had conquered the city, taken it by siege, and it didn't take them long to move into the South Carolina backcountry and the Piedmont and establish their presence with garrisons in some of these towns. So if you look on the map in South Carolina, you'll see places like Cheraw and Camden and 96 and Rocky Mount. Those are some of the places where the British occupied immediately after taking Charleston. So they, with the American force defeated at Charleston by their surrender, and the British spreading out in a web across the state, they had pretty much taken South Carolina and given parole to many loyalists, forced other patriots to surrender, stay out of the field. So it was very successful. Now, in June of 1780, about a month after the siege was over, Sir Henry Clinton went back to the British base at New York with several thousand troops and left Cornwallis in charge at Charleston with a slightly smaller force. So Cornwallis, who was an aggressive commander, he decided that he was going to move forward into the backcountry, further defeat any Patriot forces, and move into North Carolina to conquer that state as well. So in this phase, starting in August of 1780, we hear about a lot of the battles that are famous in the South, one after the other. So Cornwallis and the British troops who were occupying Camden reinforced Camden, and in August of 1780, Cornwallis was faced with a reconstituted American force who had came down from the north under Major General Horatio Gates. General Gates met Cornwallis at the Battle of Camden, August 16, 1780, and was defeated, his army routed, and had to retreat back into North Carolina. So Cornwallis kept moving north through Winnsboro, up toward Charlotte, and had just crossed into North Carolina across the state line, when part of his army of loyalists, led by Patrick Ferguson, was defeated at Kings Mountain, South Carolina, to the west of Charlotte. So he had to drop back for part of that into South Carolina, back to Winnsboro in October, November, December to refit, get reinforcements, and try again to invade North Carolina once his army was strong enough. So they tried to do that again in January 1781, and as they got toward Charlotte, the detachment Cornwallis sent to the west to try to defeat American troops at operating to the west, they were defeated by the Americans under Daniel Morgan at the Battle of Cowpen, South Carolina, on January 17, 1781. This was a battle where the British were led by the famous or infamous Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, who had a mixed force of infantry and cavalry. They were loyalists, although Tarleton was a regular British Army officer. So Tarleton was defeated, lost about 1,000 of his men, 800 to 1,000 of his men, 2 cannons, pretty significant defeat for the British. However, Cornwallis decided that they were going to push ahead and not retreat as he had done at Kings Mountain. He moved into North Carolina late in January through Charlotte, while Daniel Morgan's troops retreated from Cowpens to avoid getting caught by Cornwallis. So at this point, the British were facing General Nathanael Greene as the American commander. Back in October, after the defeat at Camden that General Gates had suffered, Congress decided to replace Gates and took the recommendation from George Washington to appoint Nathanael Greene. So Greene was the one who became the Southern Department commander. So we'll talk a little bit about Greene right now before we pick up the story where he arrives in Charlotte December 2nd, 1780 to replace Greene. So, to replace Gates. So General Greene was a Rhode Islander. He was a former Quaker who left that confession in order to become active in Rhode Island militia affairs. So he became an officer in the militia. He had no formal training, but read widely. He had a limited education, but as we can see from his letters today, that he often quoted Shakespeare, alluded to the Roman and Greek philosophers and poets, knew his Roman history, Greek history, so he was very well educated, considering that he did not attend any kind of extensive formal schooling beyond the basics. But he had been with Washington since the Siege of Boston in 1775, 1776, and had become really Washington's most trusted general. So Washington recommended and Congress appointed Greene to be the commander in the South in October, and Greene immediately decided to head out for North Carolina based on Washington's orders. So we're going to go to the next map here. And here we can see, excuse me, here we can see part of Greene's route and area of operations. So General Greene left the West Point, New York area and stopped in Philadelphia to beg Congress for money and equipment, supplies, and troops. He also did the same in Annapolis, Maryland, the capital, so that he could try to get support for the operations to the South. As he traveled south, though, he quickly came to realize that there were very few supplies, money, or men to be had, and was able to ascertain that anything that he would be able to get would have to come from farther north, because the South was very depleted in its supplies and troops. So on this map, you can see General Greene's route to join his new command. So from Annapolis on the top right-hand corner of the map, he crossed the Potomac River at Alexandria and moved south by way of small towns in Virginia, such as Dumfries, then Fredericksburg, Hanover Courthouse, and finally Richmond. He conferred with Governor Jefferson at the time and the Virginia legislature and started to set up a logistical apparatus in Virginia to support the war in North Carolina. And here in Richmond, and just below Richmond at Chesterfield Courthouse, Greene left Major General Baron von Steuben there to be the facilitator of supplies, material, and men to move from Virginia into North Carolina. Many of you probably remember von Steuben's name as being the drill master of Valley Forge, who molded the Continental Army into a better fighting condition and training. This was the same general that had come down south with Greene, but Greene quickly realized he needed somebody with authority and experience in Virginia to get all the logistical and supply matters resolved, and that's who he chose, and chose wisely. So Greene moved into North Carolina by way of Hillsborough. He passed through the small crossroads of Guilford Courthouse, which is now north or in the northern part of the city of Greensboro, North Carolina. Took the old Salisbury Road through Guilford Courthouse and Salisbury, and finally arrived to take up his new command in December 2nd, 1780, and relieved Gates. Now, Greene was shocked by what he saw when he got there. He only had about 1,000 or so Continentals in horrible condition, ill-fed, poorly armed, uniforms of rags. So he had to rebuild very quickly in order to face the oncoming British attack. Now on this map, you can see a few rivers here. First, we have the Catawba River, which is not labeled here on this map, but it's the river that runs through the word Salisbury. And to the west, to the east of that is the Yadkin. So you can also see Cowpens on this map. General Morgan retreated from Cowpens towards Salisbury, and Greene began to gather his troops around Salisbury. So he collected them from Charlotte, Guilford Courthouse, and Cheraw in South Carolina. The British started chasing the Americans and crossed the Catawba at a place called Cowan's Ford. That is today mostly covered by modern Lake Norman, but it was at the southern end of that lake where the British crossed the Catawba River and forced Morgan to retreat. Now, Greene was trying to keep rivers between his small army and the larger British army, which had been reinforced by several hundred men. In fact, probably around 1,200 men in late January. So Cornwallis had quite an army to chase Greene's small force. So the British continued to press the Americans, and Greene retreated across the Yadkin River just east of Salisbury at Trading Ford. He collected his men at Guilford Courthouse. He had a few days of breathing room here because the Yadkin was flooded from rains, so it made it difficult for Cornwallis to cross the British Army there. So at Guilford Courthouse, he began to discuss his plan with his subordinate generals, including Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, who was a cavalry commander, later became father of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Also Colonel William Washington, a distant cousin of George Washington, who had more cavalry. His Continental Army officers, such as John Eager Howard and Otho Holland Williams, Andrew Pickens, of militia officer and commander of Carolina militia. And they made a decision, which was they were going to cross the Dan River into Virginia and be able to refit, regroup, and reinforce before trying to face the British in North Carolina. Greene realized he just did not have the men, the equipment, the military material to be able to do this. Cornwallis's men had burned a lot of their baggage and wagons after the Battle of Cowpens in order to be able to chase Greene. And Greene knew that he had to really be able to get reinforced and resupplied to do this. So when the British started coming across the Yadkin River at Shallowford, north of Salisbury, and through the Moravian towns of Bethabara and Bethania and Salem, they posed quite a threat to the Americans. So Greene decided on a ruse in order to get the bulk of his army across the Dan River by having a smaller group of faster moving light infantry act as a decoy. So the main army would leave Guilford Courthouse and head for the Dan River at Irwin's and Boyd's ferries, both of which are near South Boston, Virginia today, just inside the Virginia line. However, the decoy unit of light infantry, led by Otho Holland Williams and with the cavalry of Lee and Washington, they would move close to Cornwallis and convince the British commander that as they retreated toward what is now Danville on the Dan River, the British would chase them instead of Greene's army. So Greene's army would move to the northeast, and the decoy unit led by Williams would move north toward what's now Danville at Dix's Ferry. So Cornwallis took the bait and started chasing the light troops, which allowed Greene to get to Irwin's Ferry and Boyd's Ferry. The light troops were able to stay ahead of Cornwallis, sometimes only by 100 yards, sometimes only by an hour. It was a close run chase that became known as the Race to the Dan. And the light troops wound up crossing at Irwin's Ferry and Boyd's Ferry several hours ahead of Cornwallis, who was not able to catch Greene. So Greene was north of the Dan River. His men were able to camp and slowly rebuild near today's Halifax Courthouse, just a little bit north of Halifax Courthouse. So Cornwallis decided, well, I can't chase Greene anymore, and he's going to get reinforced, and my troops haven't been reinforced or resupplied in quite a while, so he dropped down to Hillsborough. Greene gave his men a 2 or 3 day rest and afterwards began to chase the British. If you look at the map here, the two forces operated for about 2 weeks in late February, early March between Hillsborough and Guilford Courthouse. Greene wanted to get close enough to the British so that he could threaten them, but not too close where Cornwallis could turn around and really attack and destroy part or all of the American forces. So there were some battles and skirmishes in here, including what later became known as Pyle's Massacre and also Weitzel's Mill. But Greene mainly operated along the Haw River between Guilford Courthouse and Hillsborough. So can you get it so that it just is on me? What do I need to do? Okay. So now we're right before the battle. The battle was fought on March 15th, 1781. Cornwallis's troops, mostly British regulars. He had one Hessian regiment, Tarleton's cavalry, some artillery, but very few loyalists. Almost all the men were regular army, British redcoats, and a regiment of Hessians. So this was a small, experienced, but very tired and worn out force of approximately 2,000 men. Now, the reason why Greene was operating this cat and mouse affair where he could get close to Cornwallis but not risk attack was because he had lost a lot of his militia troops prior to the battle, and he was trying to get reinforced once he got into Virginia. And once he got down to North Carolina, a few things occurred that lined up to enable him to be able to get closer to Cornwallis and risk a battle. First, he was able to get Continental Army reinforcements from Virginia and Maryland. So he had 4 Continental regiments, 2 Maryland, 2 Virginia. Some of the Virginians were newly recruited, but fairly well equipped and uniformed and well led. One of the Maryland regiments, the 1st Maryland Regiment, led by John Eager Howard, that was one of the best regiments in the Continental Army, and certainly the best and most experienced and well led in the South. The 2nd Maryland, however, was recently recruited. They were recruited from all over the state of Maryland. So a lot of the men didn't know their officers. Some had experience, a lot didn't. So really, that was a regiment that that Greene knew could possibly be unreliable. Now, one of the other factors that happened to come together in early March was that Greene received over 1,000 North Carolina militiamen from the middle and eastern part of North Carolina, and they were on limited enlistments, but they were able to, the Carolinians were able to bring hundreds and hundreds of Piedmont and eastern North Carolina county militias over to at least temporarily reinforce Greene. And finally, he was joined by over 1,000 Virginia militia who were also well led, and many of these militia troops had seen service before in Continental Army units or as militiamen in prior campaigns. So these were pretty reliable troops from Virginia, in addition to the North Carolina militia. So one of the things that I write about in the book, which almost no other secondary book or article on the battle talks about or concludes, is that Greene was actually looking to attack the British by this point. By the 12th, 13th, 14th of March, he was looking to attack. Almost every book, both modern and 100 years ago, described Greene's plan as taking up a defensive position around Guilford Courthouse and waiting for Cornwallis to attack. And they say that when the army had been camped there in early February, Greene looked at it and said, this is a great defensive position, and hopefully I'll be able to maneuver Cornwallis into attacking me on the ridges around in the woods around Guilford Courthouse. Well, it is true that while he was at Guilford Courthouse in early February, he was able to see the defensive positions around Guilford Courthouse. He was able to see that just north of the battlefield along Troublesome Creek, there was a great defensive position that his army could retire to if they were defeated. However, his writings and the writings of several of his officers, other pension application statements, even some of the British writings, show that Greene was actively trying to attack Cornwallis when the British were camped just before the battle at Deep Creek Quaker Meeting House, which is near today's town of Jamestown, near High Point in the Guilford Courthouse, Guilford County area. So Greene intended to attack. He sent 2 reconnaissance units to be the eyes and ears of the army, one led by Washington, the other by Light Horse Harry Lee, and still trying to figure out how to attack the British. He brought his command around Guilford Courthouse, but things changed a little bit. His scouts were able to detect that the British army was moving and stirring and getting ready to move at about 3 a.m. on March 15th, and that they were headed toward Guilford Courthouse by way of the New Garden Friends meeting house, where Guilford College is today, along a part of the old Salisbury Road that locally was known as New Garden Road. So knowing that the British were coming at him, Greene decided at that point to put his army in a defensive posture near Guilford Courthouse. So we're going to bring up the last map, and this will show you a good idea of what the battlefield looked like to Greene. Okay, so here you have the 15th of March, 1781, and the British had come from the bottom of this map, from the New Garden meeting area, again near today's Guilford College. And at the top of this map, you can see at the crossroads a small square near some fields. That's Guilford Courthouse. The old Salisbury Road continued to the top of the map, and the road that goes off toward the left top of the map from Guilford Courthouse and from the old Salisbury Road was the Reedy Fork Road that crossed Reedy Fork, which was a fork of the Haw River about 3 miles away. So Greene took up a position, as you can see here, with 3 blue lines. That represents the 3 lines that he had in his army. The first line in the middle of the map, the lowermost one on the map that the British attacked first, Greene deployed his militia from North Carolina on both sides of the road at the edge of the woods that overlooked a muddy field that had not yet been planted. To the right of the first line, which is on the left of this map, he placed a unit of Continental Army cavalry, a company of the Delaware Regiment, also Continental, and some riflemen. That was to protect the flank and try to help the North Carolina militia. Likewise, on Greene's left, the British right, he placed another unit of riflemen led by Light Horse Harry Lee and his cavalry, some militia riflemen, and some Continental riflemen, in order to do the same thing, to try to bolster his flank. In the middle, he placed his Virginia militia regiments. He put 1 regiment on the left of the road and 1 on the right of the road in very thick, brushy woods amid ravines on either side of the road. And then finally, as you can see at the top of the map, his Virginia and Maryland Continentals, which were on a ridge slightly in front of, to the southwest of, the courthouse and the Reedy Fork Road. So why did Greene deploy his troops in this manner? Well, he got some advice from Daniel Morgan, who used a very similar deployment at the Battle of Cowpen. And Morgan reasoned, and then so did Greene, that they could put the North Carolina militia in front of the American position and order them to fire 2 or 3 volleys and then fall back. This played to the strengths of the militia because Greene and Morgan before him at Cowpens knew that the frontline militia was not going to stay around and fire multiple volleys at an advancing British Army force with fixed bayonets coming at them. So rather than make them do this and probably see them all run away, Morgan and then Greene used this deployment with the Continental forces and riflemen on the flanks to shoot into the British lines as they advanced. So the North Carolinians were ordered to fire a few volleys and fall back. The Virginia troops were ordered to do the same thing. They were ordered to stand as long as they could, try to bloody and slow down and cause a lot of casualties for the British, and then move back. And finally, the last line would have been Virginia and Maryland Continentals, supported by some artillery, which were going to face the British after they had already had to fight their way through the first two lines. So did it work? Well, not really. It worked partially. A lot of the North Carolina militia were in the first line. They were behind a rail fence at the edge of some woods on either side of the Old Salisbury Road. Now, you can see that Cornwallis also deployed his troops on the left and the right of the road. And again, these were all veterans. He had some reserves behind these frontline attackers, and Tarleton's cavalry was waiting to attack any wavering American units or to exploit any weaknesses. So Cornwallis quickly moved across the creek. As you can see, the bridge there, that's the Horsepen Creek, deployed in open fields near an old farmstead and moved to attack right away. That was Cornwallis's typical way of attacking. He did the same thing at Camden. It was very successful. So he started to do that. A lot of the North Carolina militia fled without firing a shot when the British attacked. However, some did stay on that front line and were able to fire several volleys, as were the regular units on each flank, to try to hold up the attack, to cause a lot of casualties. So the British did begin to suffer casualties right away. But many of the North Carolinians Greene complained after the battle, had run pretty quickly. So many of them did not stay around, but the British continued to advance. Now, it became very confusing. After the first action where they crossed the fields to hit the Americans at the fence line, after that, there was a lot of thick woods, and the British troops lost alignment with each other. Part of the Americans on the first line fell back, not directly toward Guilford Courthouse, but to their rear and left. So they were moving away from the courthouse. And you can see that on the map where some of the units on the American front line are moving toward the right of the map rather than straight up toward where Greene's Continentals were. They were chased by Hessians and Highlanders, and eventually Tarleton and his cavalry attacked them. Many of them forced back, including riflemen from Virginia, Western Virginia, under Colonel William Campbell and Light Horse Harry Lee. But the British attacked the American troops, the Virginians, on the second line, and the evidence shows from a lot of the pension applications that some of the Virginia troops fired 12 to 14 volleys at the British. So that's a lot of firing when you consider that it's in the woods. They didn't know exactly where the British were at all times. Cornwallis, in a famous incident, almost rode into the American lines because of the smoke and the misty conditions and the trees and the woods. And that was on the second line against the Virginians. But eventually the Virginians were pushed back, and Cornwallis and his troops were able to come to a ravine with a little creek running through it on the other side of which was Greene's position of Continentals. Now, the British didn't arrive opposite the Americans all at one time because of the confusing terrain. So first, the British on the left-hand side of their line attacked the Virginians, mostly the 33rd Regiment of Foot and some Hessians, but they were repulsed. Then the part of the Guards, the British Guards, another regiment, attacked the Maryland Continentals. Now, if you're behind the American lines and looking toward the British, the Continentals of the Maryland troops were on the left-hand side of Greene's line, the Virginians on the right. And the 2nd Maryland, which was very new, as I mentioned, and not a lot of veterans or not enough officers either, they were attacked by the Guards and almost immediately fled. And the Guards chased them toward and beyond the courthouse, captured 2 American artillery pieces. It was a disaster for Greene's left flank. However, because of the ridges and the ravines and the woods, the rest of the Continentals and Greene did not see the 2nd Maryland run initially. They were not aware that the left regiment had broken and fled until some Maryland staff officers of the 1st Maryland next to them saw that the British were now behind the American line. So this created a fight on the ridge and below the ridge between the 1st Maryland Regiment and the British Guards. And it was very bloody, a lot of bayonet wounds, sword wounds, many casualties, artillery firing. It was a chaotic scene, but the Americans did incredibly well, especially compared to Camden, where the troops were routed. One thing that happened at this point that was very important, though, is that William Washington and his cavalry, who had been on the first line with the North Carolinians, they had retreated back to Greene's line of Continentals. And when they saw that this attack had been made by the Guards, they rode from Greene's right behind the American lines to Greene's left and attacked the Guards in a devastating cavalry charge, which broke up the Guards' attack and forced them back. Now, at this point, Greene became aware that the 2nd Maryland was no longer a unified regiment. They had fled the field. He saw a lot of oncoming British troops getting ready to attack. His 1st Maryland had suffered casualties. He realized that now was a very crucial time and decided with an abundance of caution that he was going to retreat. He did not want to face an attack with one of his Continental Army regiments routed, his militia largely gone, and the British ready to attack. He decided that it was time to withdraw. And that was a prudent decision. Washington would have done the same thing, I think, George Washington. Greene had to keep some semblance of an army in the field. He couldn't risk having his entire army routed or even captured. And he knew that if there was going to be any way to keep an American presence in the South, a viable threat to the British, that he had to keep some of his men together. So he was able to bring off several thousand men from the field back to his rally point along Troublesome Creek to the north near a place called Speedwell Ironworks. It was about 10 miles away or so along the Reedy Fork Road, which again, as I mentioned earlier, leads away from the battlefield. And he was able to get his Continentals off. He was able to retreat and even put one of the Virginia regiments in a blocking position at the bridge that led over Reedy Fork in order to prevent a British pursuit. So what does it all mean? Well, Greene was able to keep the remainder of his army intact, although he lost almost all his militia. But more importantly, Cornwallis, although the victor of the battle because the Americans retreated, Cornwallis saw that his army had been devastated. The British lost about 25% casualties. They lost, killed and wounded a lot of officers. It began to rain. He was still, again, far from his supplies, no prospect of reinforcement. None of the loyalists in the area really came out to help him during this, during the weeks before the battle or afterwards. In fact, really the only North Carolinians in the area who did help were the local Quakers who took in the wounded of both sides, brought them to houses and their churches and meeting houses to try to help them recuperate. So Cornwallis and his army moved down the Cape Fear River by way of what is now Fayetteville, used to be called Cross Creek, to Wilmington. Greene pursued at a respectful distance, but as he realized how many wounded Cornwallis had, how many wounded there were still along the road, he tried to catch up with them, but was not able to do so. So Cornwallis went to Wilmington and reached Wilmington in early April, and Greene had a decision, which was to either pursue the Continentals, either to pursue the British to Wilmington and try to attack and defeat Cornwallis there, which might have been difficult because the British had already occupied Wilmington in January of 1781 and had some defensive positions. Or he could move his army into South Carolina and maintain the appearance of an offensive, maintain the appearance of trying to recapture South Carolina, and look like it was a victorious, reconstituted American army. And that's what he did. He moved into South Carolina. Cornwallis, however, decided that he was not going to chase Greene any longer in South Carolina, and decided that Virginia had to be subdued, his words. They had to be knocked out of the war because that's where all of Greene's logistical tail was located, to use a modern phrase. All his supplies, his equipment, his weapons, his food, his new recruits, it was all coming from Virginia. And Cornwallis believed that if he could knock out that supply source, then Virginia, then the war would be won. As we know, that didn't happen. He eventually surrendered in October at Yorktown. But was this an important victory at Guilford Courthouse? In my book, I argue, yes, it was, because it was the battle that forced Cornwallis out of the Carolinas. Kings Mountain did not. Cowpens did not. But once Greene battled him and Cornwallis suffered so many casualties, that was really the last time there was a substantial British army in the South of that size. So that's my argument there. So I hope this has been informative, and I hope you enjoy the book. Okay, now we give this back to Stacy. Mm-hmm. How do we do that? Can we make her the host? Make host, there you go. Do it. Yes. Okay. All right, Stacy, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much. That was incredible. We just have a couple of questions. Okay. What do you feel was Greene's biggest challenge during the Battle of Guilford Courthouse? Well,
during the battle or the campaign?
Your choice.
I would say, yeah. I would say once once he knew that Cornwallis was going to attack him, and he had deployed his troops the best way he could, I think he managed the battle very well. As far as a challenge, I think the challenge was really spending from early December to the middle of March trying to create a small army that would allow him to even get to the battlefield. One of the things that really impresses people when they read Greene's published correspondence, which is 13 volumes, the section that relates to his early days in command of the Southern Department through the battle, his descriptions of the troops and lack of supplies are amazing. He constantly says that some of the men can't even appear in formation because they don't have enough clothing. They're literally wrapping blankets around themselves in February and March, and are almost too, indecently dressed to be able to come to the field. He couldn't get enough militia. Food was scarce. The lack of cavalry was also important. William Washington and Light Horse Harry Lee did a fantastic job, but they were constantly looking for more, not only horses, but supplies needed for cavalry, all the bridles, bits, saddles, and all that kind of stuff. The challenge of the militia was constantly coming and going, refusing to serve, arriving with no weapons. But he was able to, in that last week before the battle, all the stars aligned for Greene, and I think that was the main challenge he had to overcome.
That's incredible. So just continual lack of resources, and he was able to overcome all of that. That's
right, and that was true for the whole war. It really was.
So in terms of your research, you mentioned Greene's published papers. Was that the majority of where you found your research material, or where were you able to find those materials?
Well, Cornwallis's correspondence for 1780 and 1781 are also published, so that's important. Tarleton wrote memoirs of his Southern campaign. Light Horse Harry Lee did as well. There's also the North Carolina Colonial and State Records, which were published in the late 19th century, about 26 volumes, which are now online. Gates's papers, pension applications made by hundreds and hundreds of soldiers and militiamen that provide often very, very interesting detail that you don't get by reading the upper officers' papers. So there's a lot out there. And folks can find a lot of it at Guilford Courthouse National Military Park. They have quite a collection there. And a lot of it's on, almost all the pension applications now are online too.
Awesome, that's incredible. Last question. I know that often as historians, when researching something, we find out a fact or a piece of information that really just that shocks us or fills us with joy. Do you have one of those pieces of information from your research that just really stuck out to you, that really hit home for you?
I guess for me, I had read about this battle for 25 years. Almost all of my graduate work at Ohio State was North Carolina and the Revolution. So I was very familiar with a lot of the sources, but one of my advisor at Ohio State told me, you'll never learn so much about a topic as when you write about it. So you hear a lot of these things about famous events, but then when you start researching it and say, well, I thought Greene moved to this position because of X, Y, and Z, and it turns out to be an opposite conclusion. And that's why I mention my conclusion about Greene being on the offensive before the battle, and that it was not a foreordained conclusion of his to take up a defensive position before the battle. Almost every modern book, and I mean every modern book, very, very few exceptions, books, articles, websites, that kind of thing, they as I said, they conclude that because Greene had been at Guilford Courthouse the month before, he must have decided then and there he was coming back and Cornwallis would attack him. Well, no one could have predicted that in the first place, but more importantly, he did not move to Guilford Courthouse just to have Cornwallis attack him. There are several sources, including Greene and the other officers, who do say that they were moving to attack the British. And part of that is because he knew he only had most of those North Carolina and Virginia militiamen for a very, very short time, and he wanted to make use of them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maass. This has been an awesome lecture and so enjoyed, and we so appreciate you autographing your books for us. One more plug to check out the Museum Shop website for those if you haven't done so already. And we hope that you guys will join us next month for our History at High Noon. It'll be August 12th. And check our social media accounts for more information on that. Thank you so much, Dr. Maass. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You guys take care. We'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you.